"Do not look up," the voice said, low and controlled, cutting through the cold air like a line drawn in stone. The yard held its breath. 30 women stood in a row, boots pressed into frozen ground, the morning temperature barely above 40 degrees, their thin uniforms offering no warmth. No one moved. Not yet. The order had already been given once. It did not need to be repeated. Anna Weber felt her fingers stiffen before she even touched the first button. Not from the cold. From memory. From everything they had been told would happen if they were captured. Around her, she could hear breathing, shallow, uneven, controlled too tightly. Someone to her left whispered something in German, too quiet to understand, or maybe not meant to be understood. The guard stood 10 feet away. Not shouting. Not advancing. Just waiting. That was worse. Anna kept her eyes forward at first, fixed on a point beyond the fence where the horizon blurred into pale gray sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the wire, there were roads, houses, ordinary mornings. Somewhere out there, people poured coffee into cups without thinking about war. Here, time narrowed into a single moment that stretched too long. "Undress for inspection," the officer had said. Calm. Measured. As if it were routine. As if it meant nothing. Anna swallowed slowly, her throat dry. She had seen inspections before. But never like this. Never with this silence. Her hand moved. One button. The small click echoed louder than it should have. She stopped, just for a second, her breath catching. No reaction. No laughter. No movement from the men watching. Another button. Around her, others began to follow. Fabric shifted. Boots scraped lightly against dirt. No one spoke. No one dared to meet another's eyes. The world reduced itself to sound. Cloth. Breath. A distant crow somewhere beyond the fence. Anna's heartbeat counted seconds she could not escape. This was the moment, she thought. This was where everything they feared would begin. She braced herself without knowing how. And then something didn't happen. No footsteps forward. No raised voices. No sudden shift in tone. Instead, a different sound. Leather boots turning on gravel. Anna hesitated, just slightly, her fingers pausing mid-motion. She looked up before she could stop herself. The officer, Captain James Whitaker, had turned away. Not partially. Completely. His back now faced them, shoulders squared, gaze fixed on. Nothing in particular beyond the yard. "Eyes down," he said quietly. Not to them. To his men. The response was immediate. Heads lowered. Gazes dropped. One soldier shifted his stance, turning slightly so his line of sight broke completely. Another took a step back. Space widened. Anna blinked, unsure if she had understood what she was seeing. A guard approached, not quickly, not forcefully, carrying something folded over his arm. A blanket. He did not look at her as he held it out. Just extended it into her reach, eyes fixed on the ground beside her boots. The air changed. Not warmer. But different. The tension did not disappear. It transformed. Anna took the blanket slowly, her hands still trembling, but for a different reason now. She glanced once more toward the captain. He had not moved. Had not turned back. And in that stillness, something inside her shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that she would remember this moment long after the war ended. The blanket was heavier than it looked, thick wool carrying the faint scent of storage and cold air, and Anna held it close without fully wrapping herself in it yet, as if unsure whether this was real or something that might be taken back just as quickly as it had been offered. Around her, the same quiet exchange unfolded again and again, hands reaching, fabric passing, no words spoken, no eyes lifted. The ground beneath their boots remained hard and dry, a thin layer of frost beginning to melt as the morning pushed forward, but the air still carried that early chill that settled into bones. Anna adjusted her grip on the blanket, finally pulling it around her shoulders, the warmth immediate but unfamiliar, almost undeserved. She noticed the others doing the same, movement slow, careful, like people relearning how to exist inside their own bodies. No one rushed. No one dared to break the fragile order that had formed without being commanded. A few feet away, one of the younger women hesitated, her hands trembling too much to manage the fabric, and another stepped closer, helping her without a word, their heads still lowered, their gestures small and contained. It felt less like a group of prisoners now and more like something else, something quieter, something held together by a shared understanding that had not existed minutes before. Anna's eyes moved again, drawn back to the figure standing apart from all of it. Captain Whitaker had not shifted. His posture remained steady, boots planted, shoulders squared, gaze fixed outward as if guarding a horizon no one else could see. There was no urgency in him, no impatience, only a kind of deliberate stillness that seemed intentional, as if he understood that this moment required nothing more than restraint. A medic entered the yard, his steps measured, carrying a worn leather bag that creaked softly with each movement. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The purpose of this inspection revealed itself not through explanation but through action. He moved from one woman to the next, checking pulse, observing signs of exhaustion, asking simple questions in slow, careful English, sometimes repeating them until they were understood. There was no force in his voice, only procedure, practiced and calm. Anna watched him approach, her body tensing again out of habit, but this time the tension did not take over. She could see his hands before they reached her. Steady. Clean. Focused. He did not look at her any longer than necessary. He did not linger. When it was her turn, she extended her wrist without being asked, the motion surprising even herself. The medic nodded once, noting something on a small pad, then moved on. That was all. No humiliation. No hidden intent. Just a task completed. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than anything else. She tightened the blanket slightly around her shoulders and allowed herself one more glance toward the captain. He still had not turned around. Not once. And in that refusal, in that choice to see nothing, Anna began to understand something she had not expected to learn here, in this place, on this morning. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it was the decision to step back. Sometimes, it was the discipline to do nothing at all. The inspection ended without announcement, just a gradual slowing of movement until the medic closed his leather bag and stepped back, the soft click of the latch sounding louder than it should have in the quiet yard, and for a moment no one seemed to know what came next, as if they had all been waiting for something else, something harsher, something that never arrived. Anna kept the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the weight of it grounding her in a way she did not expect, her fingers no longer shaking but still tense, as if her body had not yet accepted that the moment of danger had passed. Around her, the other women stood in a loose line that no longer felt forced, their posture changing in small ways, shoulders lowering, breathing deepening, eyes no longer fixed only on the ground but beginning to move again, cautiously, like people stepping out of a dark room into unfamiliar light. A guard nearby shifted his stance and cleared his throat softly, not to command attention, but almost as a signal that the moment had ended, and then, quietly, he gestured toward the barracks with an open hand. No shouting. No urgency. Just direction. One by one, the women began to move, their steps slow at first, boots pressing into the dirt with a steadiness that had been missing before, the line dissolving into something more natural, less controlled. Anna followed, adjusting the blanket as she walked, the fabric brushing against her arms with each step, a reminder of what had just happened and what had not. She passed within a few feet of the captain. Close enough to hear the faint sound of his breathing. Close enough to see the edge of his profile without fully looking. He remained facing away, as if the inspection was still ongoing, as if his role in it required nothing more than his continued refusal to turn around. For a brief second, Anna slowed. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to notice. There was no tension in his stance. No sign of strain. Just control. Deliberate and complete. She continued walking. Inside the barracks, the air felt warmer, carrying the scent of wood and worn fabric, a contrast to the sharp cold outside, and the women moved to their assigned spaces with quiet efficiency, folding blankets, sitting on bunks, adjusting clothing, each action small and careful, as if preserving something fragile that had just been given to them. No one spoke at first. The silence held, but it was different now. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Just present. A few minutes passed before a voice finally broke through, soft and uncertain, asking a simple question in German that did not need an answer. Others responded with small nods, brief glances, the kind of communication that required no words. Anna sat on the edge of her bunk. Her hands resting on the folded blanket in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fabric as if it might explain itself. She replayed the moment again, not the fear, not the order, but the absence of what she had expected to follow. The turning away. The lowered eyes. The space that had been given instead of taken. It did not fit into anything she had been told. It did not match the stories. And that was what unsettled her most. Not what had happened. But what it meant. Outside, footsteps moved across the yard, distant voices carried on the air, the camp returning to its routine as if nothing unusual had occurred, but inside the barracks, something had shifted, something quiet and permanent, something that could not be undone simply by returning to the way things were before, and Anna realized, without fully understanding how, that this moment would stay with her, not as a memory of fear, but as a question she would not be able to answer. The day did not pause for what had happened. By late morning, the sun had climbed just enough to soften the edge of the cold, turning the frost into thin lines of water that traced the dirt paths between the barracks, and the camp moved with its usual rhythm, boots on gravel, distant voices, the metallic clink of tools being carried from one place to another. Anna stood near the doorway for a moment before stepping fully outside, the blanket now folded over her arm instead of wrapped around her shoulders, her posture straighter than it had been earlier, though she could not say exactly why. The air felt different, or maybe she did. A group of women passed her, heading toward the work detail, their movements steady, their expressions quieter but no longer fixed in the same rigid tension. One of them glanced at Anna, just briefly, and there was something in that look that had not been there before, not relief, not gratitude, but recognition. As if they had all seen the same thing and understood it without speaking. Anna moved toward the water pump, her boots pressing into the damp ground, each step deliberate, her mind replaying fragments of the morning in no clear order, the sound of buttons, the stillness of the guards, the weight of the blanket, the way the captain had turned away before anything began. It did not align with the structure she had built in her mind over months of captivity, the simple equation of power and consequence, of command and fear. This had been something else entirely. At the pump, she filled a metal cup and drank slowly, the water cold and clean, grounding her in the present, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, she allowed her eyes to move freely across the yard without immediately lowering them. She saw details she had missed before. A soldier adjusting his gloves, his movements absent of urgency. Another leaning slightly against a post, scanning the perimeter without intensity. No one watching too closely. No one pressing too hard. It was not kindness in any obvious sense. It was something quieter. Discipline, maybe. Or restraint. She set the cup down and wiped her hands on the side of her skirt, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the yard where the administrative building stood, its wooden steps worn from years of use. The door opened, and Captain Whitaker stepped out, his expression unchanged, his pace measured as he crossed the yard with the same controlled presence she had seen earlier. He did not look toward the barracks. He did not look toward the women. His attention remained forward, fixed on whatever task waited for him next. But as he passed a group of guards, one of them straightened slightly, adjusting his posture, not out of fear, but out of awareness, as if responding to a standard rather than an order. Anna watched this without meaning to, her eyes following the movement until he disappeared behind another building. There was no moment of acknowledgement. No exchange. Nothing that would mark what had happened as important. And yet it was. She felt it in the way her shoulders no longer held the same weight, in the way her breathing had settled into something steady and natural. She picked up the folded blanket again, holding it against her side, not as a necessity, but as something she chose to keep close. Around her, the camp continued, unchanged on the surface, routines unfolding exactly as they had the day before, but beneath that, something had shifted in a way that could not be measured or recorded. Anna turned back toward the barracks, her steps quiet, her mind no longer searching for what should have happened, but trying instead to understand what had. And for the first time, the question that remained was not rooted in fear, but in something far more unfamiliar. Respect. The afternoon settled over the camp with a quiet consistency, the kind that made time feel measured rather than passing, each hour marked by routine instead of change, and Anna found herself assigned to the laundry detail, a low wooden structure near the edge of the compound where steam drifted out through open slats and the air carried the scent of soap and damp fabric. Inside, the heat wrapped around her immediately, a stark contrast to the cold morning, and for a moment she paused at the doorway, adjusting to the shift, her fingers tightening slightly around the bundle of clothing she had been given to wash. The other women were already at work, sleeves rolled, movement steady, hands submerged in metal basins filled with warm water that rippled softly with each motion. No one spoke much. There were small exchanges, brief glances, the occasional quiet instruction passed from one to another, but nothing that broke the rhythm. Anna moved to an empty basin and began, her hands dipping into the water, the warmth spreading slowly through her fingers, easing a tension she had not fully noticed until it began to fade. She focused on the task, the repetition of motion grounding her, rinse, press, fold, each action simple, predictable, controllable. But her mind did not stay there for long. It returned, again and again, to the yard, to the moment that had not unfolded the way it was supposed to. Across the room, one of the women hesitated, her movement slowing as if she too had drifted somewhere else, and for a brief second their eyes met. No words were needed. The same question passed between them. Not spoken. Not answered. Just shared. A guard stood near the entrance, leaning lightly against the frame, his presence noticeable but not imposing, his gaze directed outward rather than inward, as if his role was to observe the space rather than the people within it. He shifted his weight once, adjusted his cap, then returned to stillness. No interruptions. No corrections. The work continued. Hours passed this way, measured by the steady rise and fall of steam, by the growing stacks of folded fabric, by the subtle change in light as the sun moved across the sky, and through it all, Anna felt something unfamiliar settling into place, not comfort, not trust, but a loosening of something that had been held too tightly for too long. When the detail ended, the women stepped back out into the open air, the warmth of the laundry house clinging to their skin for a moment before the cooler breeze carried it away, and Anna paused again, her eyes scanning the yard without lowering, taking in the same buildings, the same fences, the same guarded perimeter, yet seeing them differently now, as if a layer had been removed. Near the far side of the compound, she saw Captain Whitaker again, standing beside a jeep, speaking quietly with another officer, his posture unchanged, his tone unreadable from a distance. There was no indication that he remembered the morning, no sign that it held any weight for him beyond procedure. That, more than anything, stayed with her. The absence of acknowledgement. The lack of display. It had not been done for effect. It had not been done to be seen. It had simply been done. Anna shifted the folded cloth in her hands and turned back toward the barracks, her step steady, her breathing even, carrying with her not an answer, but something more difficult to define, the understanding that in a place built on control, there were still moments where something else could exist, something unspoken, something chosen, and that perhaps, without realizing it, she had just witnessed one of them. Evening arrived without announcement, the light thinning slowly until the edges of the camp softened into long shadows that stretched across the ground like quiet lines drawn between one moment and the next, and Anna sat on the wooden step just outside the barracks, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the folded blanket beside her, untouched now but not forgotten. The air had cooled again, not as sharp as the morning, but enough to carry a steady chill that settled into the silence of the place, broken only by distant sounds, boots crossing gravel, a truck engine turning over somewhere beyond the fence, the low murmur of voices carried by the wind and then lost again. Around her, a few of the women sat in similar stillness, not speaking, not interacting, simply present in the same space, each holding on to their own thoughts, their own version of the day. Anna watched the horizon, where the last trace of sunlight hovered just above the line of trees, fading in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if even the sky understood the need for quiet after what had passed. She let her shoulders relax slightly, her posture no longer held by instinct alone, and for the first time, she noticed how her breathing had changed, deeper, steadier, no longer caught between anticipation and fear. It was a small shift. But it mattered. Footsteps approached along the path, measured and unhurried, and Anna turned her head just enough to see without drawing attention. Captain Whitaker moved past the row of barracks, his figure outlined briefly against the fading light, his pace consistent, neither slow nor rushed, as if he carried the same rhythm through every part of the day. He did not look toward them. Not toward anyone. His gaze remained forward, fixed on the direction he was heading, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable from the distance. There was nothing in his movement that suggested awareness of being watched. Nothing that acknowledged the presence of those around him. And yet, his presence was felt, not as pressure, but as something more subtle, something that shaped the space without imposing on it. Anna followed his path with her eyes until he disappeared behind the administrative building, the last trace of him fading into shadow, and she found herself holding that image longer than she expected, not because of who he was, but because of what he had chosen not to do. The absence again. The restraint. It lingered. A quiet voice broke the stillness beside her, one of the younger women speaking softly in German, asking if anyone understood why the inspection had been done that way, her tone not fearful, but searching, as if trying to place the experience into something familiar. No one answered immediately. Anna did not answer at all. Not because she did not have thoughts, but because none of them felt complete enough to speak. The question remained suspended in the air, unanswered but shared, and after a moment, the silence returned, not empty, but full of something that did not need words. Anna reached for the blanket beside her and pulled it slightly closer, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric, grounding herself again in the present, in the reality of where she was. The camp had not changed. The fences still stood. The guards still walked their routes. The rules remained the same. And yet, within all of that, something had shifted in a way she could not ignore. She leaned back slightly against the wooden frame of the barracks, her eyes lifting once more to the dimming sky, and for the first time since arriving here, she did not measure the future in terms of fear alone. There was something else now. Not trust. Not hope. But the beginning of a different question, one that did not come with an answer, only a quiet, steady presence that refused to be dismissed. And she understood, in that moment, that whatever this place was, it was no longer exactly what she had believed it to be. The night settled slowly, not with a sudden drop into darkness, but with a gradual dimming that made every sound feel closer, more defined, and Anna lay on her bunk staring at the wooden beams above her, the faint creak of the structure shifting with the cooling air, each small noise carrying further in the quiet. Around her, the other women had begun to settle as well, blankets pulled up, bodies turning inward, some already asleep, others lying still in that space between thought and rest where the mind refuses to let go of the day. Anna did not close her eyes. Not yet. The events of the morning moved through her again, not as a single memory, but as fragments that refused to stay in order, the command, the stillness, the moment her fingers touched the first button, and then the absence, the unexpected shift, the quiet discipline that had followed instead of the humiliation she had prepared herself for. She turned slightly onto her side, her hand resting against the rough fabric of the blanket, her fingers tracing its edge without thinking, grounding herself in something real. It would have been easier if the day had followed the pattern she understood. Fear. Control. Consequence. That was a structure she knew how to survive. But this was different. This required something else. Something she had not practiced. A soft whisper came from the bunk above, one of the older women speaking into the darkness, not to anyone in particular, just letting the thought exist. She said it did not make sense. That it must have been a trick. That there had to be a reason behind it that would reveal itself later. No one answered. The idea hung there, fragile, waiting to be accepted or dismissed, and Anna listened, her gaze still fixed upward, considering it carefully. A trick would have required intention beyond the moment. A plan. A follow-through. But there had been none of that. No delayed consequence. No second act. Just the decision, and then the end of it. She shifted again, pulling the blanket slightly closer, the warmth settling around her shoulders, and she realized that what unsettled her most was not uncertainty, but clarity. The captain had known exactly what he was doing. Every movement had been deliberate. The turning away. The command to his men. The space created without explanation. It had not been hesitation. It had been choice. Outside, footsteps passed along the perimeter, steady and consistent, the rhythm of a routine that did not change for anyone, and the sound carried through the thin walls, a reminder that the structure of the camp remained intact, unchanged by what had happened within it. Anna closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to hold on to the feeling of that moment, to understand it without words. She saw again the line of guards lowering their gaze. The blanket in her hands. The absence of pressure where she had expected it most. It did not erase what this place was. It did not change the fact that they were prisoners. But it introduced something else into the equation. Something that could not be ignored. Her eyes opened again, adjusting to the dim light filtering in through the narrow window, and she turned her head slightly, looking across the room at the shapes of the others, each one carrying their own version of the same experience, their own interpretation of what it meant. No one would say it out loud. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was there. In the silence. In the way no one dismissed it completely. Anna let out a slow breath, her body finally beginning to release the last of the tension it had held since morning, and as the night deepened around her, she understood something she had not expected to learn in a place like this. Not all power announced itself through force. Some of it existed in restraint. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Morning returned with a thin line of light slipping through the narrow window, cutting across the wooden floor and stopping just short of Anna's bunk, and for a moment she remained still, watching it as if it carried some kind of answer, her breathing slow, steady, her body no longer held in the same rigid awareness as the day before. Around her, the others began to stir, small movements breaking the quiet, blankets shifting, feet touching the floor, the familiar rhythm of waking in a place where every day was expected to be the same as the last. But this morning felt different. Not in any visible way. The walls had not changed. The air carried the same faint chill. The sounds outside followed the same pattern. And yet, something beneath all of that had shifted, something that did not announce itself but could not be ignored. Anna sat up slowly, her feet finding the ground, her hands resting briefly on her knees as she adjusted to the light, and she noticed the absence of a feeling she had grown used to, that immediate tightening in her chest that came with the first breath of the day. It was not gone entirely. But it was quieter. Manageable. She stood, reaching for the folded blanket at the foot of her bunk, running her hand over the fabric once before setting it aside, not needing it in the same way she had the morning before. The women moved around her, preparing for roll call, their actions efficient, practiced, but there was a subtle change in the way they carried themselves, shoulders less rigid, eyes lifting more often, glances exchanged that held something unspoken but understood. No one mentioned it. No one named it. But it was there. Outside, the air was cool, the sky pale and clear, and the line formed with the same precision as always, boots aligning, body straightening, the structure of the camp asserting itself once again. Anna took her place, her posture steady, her gaze forward, and as the guards moved into position, she found herself observing them differently, not with suspicion alone, but with a kind of measured attention, as if looking for something she had not noticed before. The commands were given, simple, direct, nothing out of the ordinary, and the routine unfolded exactly as it should, names checked, movements directed, the day beginning as it always had. But when one of the guards stepped closer to adjust the spacing of the line, his voice low, his tone neutral, Anna did not flinch. She noticed it immediately. The absence of that reflex. It was small. Almost insignificant. But it mattered. Her mind registered the difference before she fully understood it. She held her position, her breathing even, her focus steady, and for the first time, she allowed herself to look, just briefly, not down, not away, but forward, meeting the space in front of her without retreat. Across the yard, near the administrative building, Captain Whitaker stood with a clipboard in hand, speaking quietly to another officer, his posture unchanged, his presence as controlled as it had been the day before. He did not look toward the line. Not once. And yet, the line held. The order remained. Not because of pressure, not because of fear, but because it had been set, clearly and without excess. Anna watched him for only a second before returning her gaze forward, but that second stayed with her, the same way the moment from the day before had stayed, not demanding attention, not forcing meaning, but existing quietly, persistently. The roll call ended. The line broke. The day moved forward. And as Anna stepped out of formation, her boots pressing into the firm ground, she realized that something within her had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like the first light of morning that did not ask permission to arrive. It simply did. And once it did, everything was seen differently. The work detail that morning took Anna beyond the usual path, past the laundry building and toward a stretch of ground near the outer fence where the soil had been turned and marked into long, narrow rows, a small garden maintained by prisoners and supervised loosely by a single guard who stood several yards away with his hands resting on his belt, watching the perimeter more than the workers themselves. The air carried the scent of earth, damp and clean, and the sky above remained clear, the kind of wide openness that made the fence feel both present and distant at the same time. Anna knelt beside one of the rows, her fingers pressing into the soil as she followed the instructions given, spacing the seeds carefully, covering them with measured movements, each action deliberate and controlled. It was simple work. Quiet work. The kind that allowed the mind to move freely while the body remained occupied. Around her, the others worked in similar silence, the occasional sound of tools shifting, of soil being turned, of someone adjusting their position, but nothing that broke the steady rhythm. Anna found herself focusing on small details again, the texture of the dirt between her fingers, the way the light shifted across the ground as the sun climbed higher, the faint breeze that moved through the space and carried distant sounds from the camp. It was different from the day before, not in activity, but in perception. She was noticing more. Seeing more. Not because anything had changed, but because she had. A shadow moved across the row in front of her, and she looked up slightly, her gaze lifting without the same hesitation that once defined every movement. Captain Whitaker stood a short distance away, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to disappear, his presence marked by stillness rather than motion. He was speaking with the guard assigned to the detail, his voice low, his tone even, and though Anna could not hear the words, she could see the effect. The guard straightened slightly, nodded once, and then stepped back, giving the group more space without being told twice. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But it was there. Anna lowered her gaze again, returning to the soil, but the image stayed with her, the same pattern repeating itself in a different form. No raised voice. No direct command. Just a standard set and understood. The work continued. Time passed in quiet increments, marked by the steady progression of the rows filling in, by the gradual shift of light, by the way the tension that once lived in every movement no longer dictated the pace. At one point, a small mistake broke the rhythm, one of the younger women dropping a handful of seeds and freezing for a second as if expecting correction, her hands hovering uncertainly above the ground. The guard glanced in her direction, then looked away, offering no comment, no reaction. The moment passed. The woman bent down, gathered what she could, and continued. No interruption. No consequence. Just continuation. Anna noticed that too. Not as an isolated event, but as part of a pattern that was beginning to take shape. She finished her row and sat back slightly on her heels, brushing the dirt from her hands, her eyes lifting once more across the field, past the line of workers, toward the fence, and beyond it, to the open land stretching out under the same sky. For a brief moment, the boundary felt less absolute, not because it had changed, but because her understanding of what existed within it had shifted. She stood slowly, adjusting her posture, and as she did, she caught sight of the captain again, already moving away, his role in the moment complete without needing acknowledgement. Anna watched him go, not with curiosity now, but with a quiet recognition of something she could not fully name, something that did not fit into the categories she had brought with her into this place. She turned back to the work, to the row in front of her, to the simple act of placing one thing into the ground and covering it carefully, and she realized that for the first time since her arrival, she was not measuring the day by what might go wrong, but by what was simply happening as it was meant to. And that, more than anything else, was new. The afternoon light shifted again, softer now, stretching longer across the rows as the work detail came to an end, and Anna stood with the others near the edge of the garden, brushing the last traces of soil from her hands, the fine dust clinging to her skin before falling away in small, quiet motions. No one rushed to leave. There was no sharp command pulling them back into formation, only a subtle signal from the guard, a small nod toward the path that led back to the barracks, and one by one, they began to move, their steps steady, their pace unforced. Anna fell into line without thinking, the rhythm of movement familiar, but the weight behind it different, no longer driven entirely by anticipation of correction, but by something more balanced, something that allowed space between action and reaction. The path curved slightly as it passed along the inner fence, the wire catching the afternoon light in thin, bright lines, and beyond it, the land stretched open and quiet, fields fading into the distance under a sky that remained unchanged by everything happening within the camp. Anna walked with her gaze forward, but not fixed, her eyes moving naturally, taking in the details around her without the immediate need to withdraw. She noticed a truck parked near the supply shed, its engine cooling, metal ticking softly in the silence. A soldier stood nearby, checking a clipboard, his movements methodical, his focus on the task rather than the people passing by. Nothing about it felt urgent. Nothing felt forced. It was simply work, carried out with a kind of consistency that no longer felt threatening. As they approached the main yard, a brief pause formed in the line, the group slowing as another detail crossed their path, men carrying tools, their conversation low and indistinct, and for a moment, the space between groups closed, then opened again, the flow continuing without interruption. Anna adjusted her step slightly, avoiding contact, her movement instinctive but no longer sharp, no longer driven by the same reflex to retreat. She passed within a few feet of the crossing group, close enough to hear the tone of their voices, calm, ordinary, and she realized how unfamiliar that had once felt. Near the barracks, Captain Whitaker stood again, not positioned as an overseer, not elevated, simply present, speaking quietly with a sergeant whose posture reflected attention without tension. The exchange was brief. A few words. A nod. The kind of interaction that carried weight without display. Anna did not slow this time. She did not pause. She walked past as she would pass any part of the camp, aware, but not fixed. And yet, as she moved beyond him, she felt it again, that same subtle shift in the space, not imposed, not directed at her, but existing nonetheless, like a standard that held itself without needing to be enforced. Inside the barracks, the air carried the warmth of the afternoon, mixed with the familiar scent of wood and fabric, and the women moved into their spaces with quiet efficiency, setting aside tools, adjusting clothing, settling into the next part of the day without needing instruction. Anna sat on her bunk, her hands resting lightly against her knees, her posture relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible just days before, and she let the moment settle without trying to define it. The camp remained what it was. The boundaries had not changed. The structure held. But within that structure, she had begun to see something else, something that did not fit into the expectations she had carried with her, something that existed not in what was said, but in what was chosen, moment by moment, without announcement. She lowered her gaze briefly, not out of habit, but out of thought, and then lifted it again, steady, clear, meeting the space around her without hesitation, and in that simple act, she understood that the change was no longer outside of her. It had already begun within. The evening meal came with the same measured routine, metal trays passed down the line, portions set without comment, the sound of utensils against tin echoing softly in the enclosed mess hall, and Anna moved with the others, her step steady, her hands receiving the tray without hesitation, the motion now familiar enough that it no longer required thought. She sat at one of the long wooden tables, the surface worn smooth from years of use, and for a moment she simply looked at the food in front of her, not with suspicion, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet awareness that had not been there before. Around her, the low murmur of voices began to form, small conversations in German, careful, subdued, but present, and she noticed how the sound itself felt different, no longer confined to whispers, no longer held back entirely. Across the room, guards stood along the walls, their presence constant but unobtrusive, their attention directed broadly rather than fixed on any single point, and Anna found herself observing them in the same way she had observed everything else throughout the day, not searching for threat, but noting behavior, pattern, consistency. One of the guards moved toward the far end of the room to adjust a window that had been left slightly open, the evening air slipping through in a thin stream, and he did it without interruption, without drawing attention, simply closing it and returning to his position as if it were the most ordinary task in the world. Anna lifted her fork and began to eat, the action simple, grounded, the taste of the food steady and real, and for a moment she focused only on that, the texture, the warmth, the rhythm of eating, allowing herself to remain present without drifting back into analysis. But the thought returned anyway, not as a disruption, but as a quiet continuation. The pattern held. Not just in one moment, not just in one place, but across the day. The absence of excess. The presence of control without force. She glanced up briefly, her eyes moving across the room until they found him again, Captain Whitaker standing near the entrance, speaking with another officer, his posture unchanged, his tone unreadable, his presence steady in a way that did not demand attention and yet held it. There was no sign that he was observing her. No indication that he was aware of her at all. And still, the space seemed shaped by him, not through action, but through expectation. Anna lowered her gaze again, returning to her meal, but the image remained, not fixed, not intrusive, just present, like a detail that had become part of the larger picture. At the table beside her, one of the women spoke quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard, saying that perhaps not everything they had been told was complete, that perhaps there were parts left out, details omitted, and another responded with a small nod, not agreeing fully, not dismissing it either, just allowing the idea to exist without conclusion. Anna listened without joining, her thoughts moving along a similar path but without the need to speak them aloud. She finished her meal slowly, setting the utensil down with a soft sound, and sat for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture relaxed in a way that still felt new. The room continued around her, the routine unfolding without disruption, trays collected, voices fading, the evening settling into its next phase, and as she stood to return her tray, she realized that the question that had followed her since the morning was no longer as sharp, no longer as urgent. It had not been answered. But it had changed. It no longer asked what would happen next. It asked instead what had already happened, and what it meant. And in that shift, something else settled into place, something quieter than certainty, but stronger than doubt, something that did not require explanation to exist. She turned away from the table and walked toward the exit, her steps even, her gaze steady, carrying that understanding with her without needing to define it, knowing only that it would remain, long after the details of the day had faded. The night returned with a deeper stillness than before, the kind that settled not just over the camp but within it, as if the space itself had adjusted to something unspoken, and Anna stood for a moment just outside the barracks after the evening meal, her breath visible again in the cooling air, her hands resting loosely at her sides, no longer clenched, no longer held in quiet tension. The sky above stretched wide and darkening, the last traces of light fading into a deep blue that held no urgency, no threat, only the steady passage of time moving forward as it always did, regardless of what changed below. Around her, the others moved slowly, some stepping inside, others lingering for a few seconds longer, as if none of them were quite ready to let the day end without acknowledging, in their own silent ways, that something had been different. Anna took a few steps forward, her boots pressing softly against the packed earth, and stopped near the edge of the yard where the fence ran in a straight, unbroken line, its shape unchanged, its purpose clear, and yet it no longer felt like the only thing defining the space. She looked out beyond it, not searching for escape, not measuring distance, just observing, allowing her gaze to rest without needing to calculate what it meant. Footsteps approached from behind, steady, familiar in their rhythm, and she turned slightly, not out of reflex, but out of awareness. Captain Whitaker moved along the path, passing within a few feet of where she stood, his presence marked again by that same controlled stillness, his eyes forward, his pace even, his focus set on the direction he was heading rather than the people around him. For a brief second, their paths aligned, not intersecting, not acknowledging, simply existing within the same space at the same time, and Anna noticed something she had not allowed herself to notice before. There was no distance in his expression that suggested indifference. There was no tension that suggested effort. There was simply a quiet certainty, the kind that did not require reinforcement. He continued walking, his figure moving past her and into the dimming light, and she did not turn to follow him this time. She remained where she was, her gaze returning to the fence, to the open land beyond, to the space that had not changed and yet no longer felt the same. Behind her, the barracks door opened and closed, the soft sound of wood against wood marking the end of another small moment, and Anna stood there a little longer, her thoughts no longer circling the same questions, no longer trying to fit what she had seen into what she had been told. The need to resolve it had faded. In its place was something quieter, something that did not ask for answers, only recognition. She understood now that what had happened in the yard that morning had not been an exception. It had been a choice. And choices, once made, revealed something deeper than rules ever could. She turned back toward the barracks, her steps unhurried, her posture steady, and as she reached the doorway, she paused just briefly, her hand resting against the wood, feeling its solid, familiar texture beneath her fingers. The camp remained. The structure held. But within it, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by routine, not by repetition, not by time. She stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind her, and in that simple motion, she carried with her a new understanding, not loud, not declared, but certain in a way that did not need to be spoken. Some lines were drawn to divide. Others were drawn to define. And sometimes, without warning, one became the other. The final hours of the day settled into a silence that no longer felt empty, but complete, as if the camp itself had reached a quiet understanding with everything that had unfolded within it, and Anna lay once more on her bunk, her hands resting loosely over the folded blanket, her eyes open but no longer searching the ceiling for answers that refused to come. The room held a steady calm, the soft rhythm of breathing around her replacing the restless tension that had once filled every corner, and she listened to it without effort, without resistance, allowing herself to exist within it instead of bracing against it. Outside, the distant sound of footsteps continued along the perimeter, unchanged, consistent, a reminder that the structure of the place remained intact, but it no longer defined the entirety of what she experienced. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to hold on to the clarity that had formed, the understanding that had not arrived all at once, but in small, deliberate moments that built upon each other without announcement. The order. The stillness. The turning away. The absence that had carried more meaning than any action she had expected. She opened her eyes again, her gaze steady, no longer shifting between fear and anticipation, but resting in something quieter, something that did not demand explanation. Across the room, one of the women turned in her sleep, the movement soft, unguarded, and Anna noticed how natural it looked, how unburdened, as if even in rest, something had eased. She adjusted her position slightly, pulling the blanket closer, not out of need, but out of choice, the weight of it familiar now, grounding, a reminder not of protection given, but of a moment that had redefined what protection could mean. The camp had not changed its rules. The fences still marked its boundaries. The guards still walked their posts. None of that had shifted. But something else had. Something that did not rely on permission, something that existed in the space between command and action, in the decisions made when no one demanded them. Anna let her breathing settle into a slow, even rhythm, her body no longer held in readiness, her mind no longer trying to reconcile two opposing versions of reality. They were no longer opposing. They existed together. And that was what changed everything. She thought of the captain, not as a figure of authority, not as a presence to be feared or understood, but as a moment, a single choice carried out without hesitation, without display, and she realized that what had stayed with her was not what he had done, but what he had refused to do. That absence had weight. That restraint had meaning. It had set a line that no one crossed, not because they were forced to stop, but because it had been made clear, without words, that crossing it was not acceptable. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the dark outline of the window, where the faintest trace of starlight filtered through, and she allowed herself, for the first time, to rest without holding part of herself back. The day ended without conclusion, without resolution in the way she had once expected, but with something else entirely, something quieter, something stronger. She did not raise her voice. She did not resist. She did not need to. Because in that single moment, when everything could have been taken from her, something had been returned instead. Not freedom. Not certainty. But something just as enduring. A standard. And once seen, it remained.